Welcome back. Today is the attack on Pearl Harbor, the effects. The last teaching video that you looked at discussed the attack on Pearl Harbor, the why. So we looked at Japan being a series of islands and having, limited space and limited resources, how they did not participate originally in the age of imperialism, how though that they did start trading with the United States and other countries, and that was good for their economy. So my husband and I visited Oahu about a year ago now. It'll be a year in May. And we visited the Pearl Harbor Museum and Memorial. So this slide is actually a picture that I took there, and I thought it was just a good reminder for the why did they end up attacking the resources that they needed. Our president at the time had said that we were no longer trading with Japan, we were no longer selling them the resources or buying things from them either. And of course, that did not make Japan happy. And that was part of the why from the previous video. Okay, so the video ended with this slide. What do you think is going to happen now that Japan has attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor? And I'm sure I have read your answers by now. So I am going to read an excerpt to you from this magazine, this Cobblestone magazine. Were we in the classroom and not at home on quarantine for COVID-19, we would be looking at this together. So this is just, again, part of the attack. So under attack, Tora, Tora, Tora. With that coded message, the leader of the first wave of Japanese pilots to approach Pearl Harbor let his superiors know that a complete surprise had been achieved. When the Japanese realized that their primary targets, U.S. aircraft carriers, were not in Pearl Harbor, they focused on the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships. All 8 battleships, most of them tightly berthed together along Battleship Row, sustained some damage. While the shocking attack hampered the United States' ability to immediately retaliate, the Japanese failure to take out storage, maintenance, and oil facilities prevented the attack from being a complete success. Nearly all of the damaged vessels were repaired and rejoined the fleet sometime during the war. Only 3 battleships were a complete loss. Okay, so another image of this. This timeline also came from this Cobblestone magazine that I was just reading you the excerpt from. I'm not going to go over every detail of the timeline, but if you look at it, 6:10 a.m., after reaching a point about 230 miles north of Oahu, the Japanese fleet launches the first wave of 183 planes, including torpedo, dive bomber, and fighter planes. So that was at 6:10. 9 o'clock to 9:55, the second wave of Japanese planes consisting of dive bombers and high-altitude bombers arrives. It targets various ships in the U.S. Navy Yard. Now on alert, U.S. military personnel greet this second wave with heavy anti-aircraft fire. We go to 1 p.m., the attacking fleet heads back to Japan. So from about 6 a.m. to 1 p.m., was this surprise attack. And to put that into kind of like a sense of how quick did that happen, that's about, a school day. So 7 a.m. you arrive, at school. And 1 p.m. is about an hour before the school day ends. So if we backed it down, we usually go 7 to 2, 6 to 1 would be a school day. So try and imagine that this occurring over that many hours of your life. So it'd be pretty fast that it would have occurred during a day. If you want to pause the video at this point and read over each excerpt of the timeline, that's a great idea, just to give you a little more sense of what the attack consisted of. So I mentioned that my husband and I were in Oahu in last May. If we were in the classroom, I had also bought a replica of the newspaper that went out at this time. So this image made me think of that. So maybe next year with those students, I'll be able to pull that out and use it. But of course, I'm sure it was, a big deal. Like the COVID is a big deal for us right now, and it's in the news every day. This was huge, I'm sure, around our country, possibly even the world in the next day's newspapers. Okay, so here's a map of Pearl Harbor. If you look at the key, you have the red images are um, battleships that were sunk, the yellow, they're damaged, the blue are destroyers. And as I read to you in the excerpt, most of our, I think all of our aircraft carriers were actually not in Pearl Harbor at the time, which ended up being, of course, a blessing for the United States. They were actually out on assignment or practicing maneuvers at the time. So, and that's going to make a big difference because if you remember in World War I, and we talked about airplanes, they weren't used necessarily as weapons themselves. They were used to transport weapons. They were used, sure, maybe to drop some bombs. They were used to transport machinery, ammunition, soldiers, but they weren't used as weapons themselves in terms of like fighting against each other and fighting against civilians or soldiers on the ground or ships in the sea. So that's going to be a really big difference in World War II. We are going to see airplanes, be used as weapons. You've got dogfights. You've got, of course, them, dropping bombs like before. But you also now have artillery, such as like machine guns attached to the airplanes, and so they're able to be weapons themselves. So that's why it ends up being very much a blessing that our aircraft carriers were actually out to sea at this time, because aircraft carriers do just what that sounds like. They carry aircraft, and the planes are able to, launch off of those aircraft carriers. So, as I said, today's we're looking at the effects of the attack. So, of course, one effect is that, you know, um, the Japanese did cause a lot of damage towards our Navy that was stationed at Pearl Harbor at the time. Killed more than 2,300 American soldiers, did destroy battleships and planes, angers the American people is going to be one of the big effects of this as well. And um, it's what brings us into World War II at the time, because we're going to declare war on Japan, and Japan was um, allied with Italy and Germany at the time. Okay, so as I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, that we went to Hawaii. So this is actually a picture that I took at the Pearl Harbor Museum and Memorial. Um, this image, I was actually on, I think I was on a submarine called the Bristow at the time, which is they've turned that into a museum also. I'll talk to you about that in just a minute. But this was a very solemn area, this circle area that you see. Had different information about loss, the battles, the damages that happened at the time. There were signs all around that asking people to be, quiet and respectful of the area. I will say that visiting this area was um, very emotional for me. I, hadn't really thought about it before, but actually being there, and you'll see an image here in just a moment of the Arizona. Um, I probably couldn't talk for about 2 hours after we visited this. I was just so kind of choked up and emotional about just thinking what had happened to our country in such a quick amount of time. Okay, so here's also an image. They have some um, replica battleships and some real ones also, ships out there. So we were on a little ship on our way out to the Arizona Memorial. Okay, and I'll talk to you about that in just a minute. But this is really interesting to me, and I wanted to share it with you guys. So, I've told you in class that my husband is a carpenter, and one of his clients that he does a lot of regular work for lives in Winston-Salem, but she actually was born on Oahu. Her father was in the Navy. One of his jobs was as a photographer. She says that she was 18 months old when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened and that he was feeding her breakfast at the time. And of course, this is, what they told her. And he left with his camera. He is actually the military or Navy photographer that took many of the firsthand images that we see today about the attack of Pearl Harbor. So when we were heading here, my husband let her know. She got in touch with her ex-husband, who still lives on Oahu, and he gave us about a 3-hour tour of the area, which was just wonderful. So this is actually on Tantalus Mountain, and he stopped here whenever he was touring my husband and I around, and we got out and he told us his firsthand recollection of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it was right here on his mountain on the island that he just pretty much considered his playground, as a child. So he said he was 6 years old the day of the attack, and they were out in the morning, playing around. When they realized that, they could hear and see the smoke, going from Pearl Harbor. And he said soon after that, they noticed what was going on in the distance, that Japanese airplanes zoomed back right over their heads. So that would have been the first wave leaving. He said that the airplanes were so close that they could see the pilots' faces and the helmets that they wore on their heads. 6 years old. So, another effect that we're not aware of, because of course it didn't happen here, but his firsthand account was, they had several friends and neighbors that were of Japanese um, origin, but they were Americans. And he said that within 24 hours of this happening, many of those friends and families just disappeared. He said that they went into hiding because they were afraid of the Americans' response towards them because they were, of Japanese heritage. Another effect, he said that they went on martial law immediately, which means that they had to stay in their homes. They could only come out at a certain time that the government said, and they had to be in their homes by a certain time. The adults were told to watch in the distance for flashing lights, that would be, more airplanes attacking, and to let their local officials know if they saw anything going on in the distance. He said that one thing that he remembers also was a barbecue was planned for a neighbor who was going into the military, and it had been planned for that weekend, like a celebration, before he goes off. And this family was of Japanese origin. And he said when his family still went to the cookout, he said most of the people that he knew who were just American origin did not come. It was fear that was driving these responses. He said that they were afraid what the family may have put in the food. So it really did, I guess some reactions really did go the way some of the Japanese heritage Americans felt like it would, that Americans would not trust them, and that happened really quickly. Yeah, he said that it was just amazing how quickly people just disappeared out of his life, and seemingly off the island because they went into hiding for fear of Americans' reactions. So this is actually the Arizona Memorial. I did not take this picture. I didn't feel the need to take pictures when we were there, but at the time, this part was damaged from weather, so we did not go on it, which was fine with me because I was already emotional enough But if you're looking at it, so you can see this is actually part of the ship, and there's the outline. You're going to see an aerial image here in just a minute of the ship. It burned for over 2 days from the attack, and it still leaks oil every day, even into modern day, into Pearl Harbor. So, what are effects? Some really quick effects. Well, in addition to what I've already told you, of course, our United States Congress declared war on Japan, which means also on Germany and Italy, since they were allies. This is going to end our time of isolationism, just like the bombing of the Lusitania or the sinking, in World War I was one of the things that finally brought us into World War I. This is going to bring us into World War II. You can see the attack on Pearl Harbor aroused and united America as nothing else could have done. So here's that aerial view I was telling you about, where you can see the actual ship under the water. A quote that if you look up anything, from our president and his speech at the time, "A day that will live in infamy," is obviously famously connected to this attack on Pearl Harbor. The naval base was the site of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, 200 aircraft, 5 battleships, 3 destroyers, 7 other ships were sunk or severely damaged by the Japanese. 2,400 Americans were killed, 1,200 were wounded. So in his speech, President Franklin Roosevelt said, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." The Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor caused the U.S. to enter World War II the next day. And today, you see, there is this memorial with the bridge over the sunk Arizona. Another famous quote, though, that also goes with this is from Japanese, I think general, high military official Yamamoto, and his response to the attack, which was supposed to have been, a way to quickly hinder the United States from being able to participate in a war, was really backfired on the Japanese. And his quote, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." So this speaks to his fear, anguish, anxiety over the fact that now their actions actually caused the United States to enter World War II. So, as a summary, of course, Americans were attacked. Americans responded with pride for their country. We've looked at this word, nationalism, and anger towards the attackers. So here it's your turn, as you often do, right? I want you to describe an event or events that have occurred to America somewhere in the past 50 years. So 50 years or, closer to where we are now, that has caused a similar reaction. So an event where Americans were attacked, where Americans respond with pride for America and anger towards the attacker. So I want you to find an event, or maybe you know of one, or you can interview a family member that this has happened to America since that time period, and we had that same reaction. And again, I want you to submit your answers any way you choose, and I look forward to reading or hearing your answers and responding to your comments.